Welcome back. I'm your host, Nick Scroggs, and today on Brickonomics, I want to talk about something that every builder deals with every single day, and that's job costing. Let me set a scene that I think a lot of builders have lived through. You're sitting across the table from a potential client, and they've gotten three bids. Yours is the highest, and they look at you and they ask very reasonably, why? Now, here's the uncomfortable question underneath that moment. Do you actually know why? Not in a general sense, not because we do good work or because we've been in business for 15 years. I mean specifically, can you sit across from that client and walk them through line by line what it costs your business to deliver a project like theirs? Labor, materials, subcontractors, internal staff, overhead allocation, and risk, and show them exactly how you arrived at that number in front of them. Most builders can't, and not because they're bad at their jobs, but because most builders price by convention rather than by math. And the convention in residential construction, at least in most markets, including ours, goes something like this: 20% markup, 10% overhead, 10% profit. That's the number people throw around here, and that's what the industry seems to accept. That's what builders charge because that's what builders have always charged. But here's the question I kept coming back to when I started looking at our own pricing: 20% on top of what exactly? And based on whose cost structure? Because the business that 20% was built for, the lean, low overhead, heavily subcontracted operation where the owner manages everything themselves, looks nothing like most new growing construction companies. It certainly looks nothing like mine. And if you're applying a pricing model built for someone else's business to your own, you're either leaving money on the table or losing it on every job, and sometimes both. Job costing is the system that closes that gap. It's the process of building your price from the actual cost of your actual business rather than from a market convention that someone else established for a different operation. And when we finally got it right, truly right, it changed everything. Not just the numbers, the client conversations, the way we thought about hiring, the way we compared contract types, the way we understood whether we were actually making money on individual projects, not just across the company in aggregate. Today's episode is about exactly that. Let's start with the 20% myth and why it's the wrong foundation for most construction businesses. The 10% overhead, 10% profit model has been floating around residential construction for as long as most people can remember. And to be fair, it's not just a random number. It reflects a real business model, just not necessarily yours. The business that it was built for looks something like this: one owner, maybe a small office staff, all fieldwork subcontracted out, low fixed payroll. The owner sells the job, manages the relationships, coordinates the subs, and collects the checks. Because almost every dollar a project costs is available subcontractor expense, the overhead structure is genuinely lean. 10% overhead on top of job cost might actually cover it. But now look at a company that has in house designers on salary, in house project managers, in house supervisors, in house labor crews, dedicated administrative staff, and multiple layers of production oversight. That company's overhead structure looks nothing like the first one. The fixed costs are significantly higher. The payroll commitment doesn't flex down between projects the way subcontractor costs do. And yet, if the company walks into the market charging 20% because that's what everyone else charges, they are systematically underpricing every single job that they take. When I started working backward from our actual annual cost structure, adding up what we paid in salaries, benefits, office expenses, insurance, equipment, and every other fixed and semi fixed costs, and then modeling what we needed to charge to cover those costs and produce a real profit margin, the number that I kept landing on was not 20%. It was higher, and sometimes significantly higher. And that created a real tension because when you go into market with a higher markup than the perceived standard, clients notice. They ask questions. Competitors use it against you. And if you can't explain where the number comes from, it just looks like greed. But here's what I learned: the problem wasn't that our markup was too high. The problem was that we were comparing it to a benchmark that was never designed for our business model. 10% overhead only works if your overhead is actually 10%. If it's higher, which it will be for any company with a meaningful internal staff, then charging 10% overhead means that you're just subsidizing your client's projects out of your own margin. The fix isn't to lower your cost to match the convention. The fix is to understand your costs well enough to build up your own number from the ground up and then be able to explain it clearly enough that the right clients will understand what they're getting. The core principle here: don't ask what the market charges, ask what your business actually costs to run, then build your pricing model around that reality, not around someone else's. The single most important job costing realization that we have, and the one that I think changes the math more than anything else for companies with internal staff, is this. If an employee is working directly on a project, they are a job cost, not a fixed cost. That sounds simple, but the implications are significant. Here's how we got there. When COVID hit and material prices became completely unpredictable, we moved a substantial portion of our work from fixed price contracts to cost plus. And cost plus changed everything about how we think about billing because on a cost plus job, the client sees the actual cost. So you can't bury things inside of a lump markup. Every line item is visible, and that means that every cost also has to be defensible. And that forced a question that we had been avoiding with fixed price for work, which was, what do we actually charge for our internal people? On a fixed price job, internal labor was effectively hidden inside of the markup. We'd estimate materials and subcontractors, add our percentage to that, and then the internal costs were just somewhere in there, absorbed by that overhead. But on cost plus, that didn't work anymore. We needed a real number for what a designer costs per hour on a project, a real number for what a project manager costs per day, a real number for what a field supervisor's time was worth as a billable item. And to get those numbers, we had to build something that I call a divisional model. The idea is straightforward, even if the execution takes some work. Instead of treating the entire company as one cost pool, you think about your business as a collection of internal service providers. Each one has its own cost structure, its own overhead, and its own billable rate. For us, that broke down into four unique divisions. The design division, our in house designers who produce drawings, renderings, and construction documentation. The crew division, or our in house field teams doing direct labor on projects. The production division, which included our project managers, project supervisors, and logistics staff who run the in field work. And the GC umbrella, or the general contracting layer that coordinates all of these other divisions and takes on the overall project risk. Each division has its own overhead. The design division has software costs, equipment, and administrative support. The crew division has tools, vehicles, and field supervision. The production division has its own management layer, and the GC layer carries company-wide overhead like insurance, offices, executive time, and business development. When you separate the overhead by division, something useful happens. You can actually see what it costs to run each part of your business at full capacity. And from that, you can derive an honest billable rate for the people working inside of each of those divisions. Here's how that math works at a basic level. Start with what you pay the employee, their base salary or hourly wage, and then add their labor burden, their payroll taxes, benefits, insurance, retirement contributions, so on. In most businesses, labor burden runs somewhere between 20 and 30% on top of base compensation. So a $60,000 salary might actually cost you somewhere between $75,000 and $80,000 all in. Then you divide by realistic billable hours. And this is where most people make a mistake because they assume an employee is billable for 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and they're not. Every employee has administrative time, internal meetings, training, business development, support, non-billable project work, and depending on the role, a realistic billable utilization might be 60 to 80% of their total hours. So if your employee costs $80,000 fully burdened and works 2,000 hours a year, but is only billable for 1,400 of them, their true billable rate is not $40 an hour. It's closer to $57 an hour. And that gap matters because if you're billing them at 40, you're losing $17 an hour every hour that they work, and you're not seeing it because it's buried in the overhead. Once you have honest billable rates, you have two choices for how to present them to clients: as a time based line item or converted into a percentage of total project costs that you add as a labor allocation. Both work. The key is that the number is derived from real math, not from convention. Here's the moment that told me we had gotten the job costing right. After we built out the divisional model and started billing internal staff as true job costs, I ran a comparison. I took a representative project type and priced it in two ways. Once as a fixed price contract with our original markup, and the second time as a cost plus contract with all internal labor billed at our newly derived rates. They landed within 5 to 10% of each other. And that might not sound dramatic, but think about what it means. If your job costing is accurate, if your fixed price estimate truly reflects the cost of your business delivering that project, then a cost plus contract on the same project should produce nearly the same number because cost plus is just fixed price, but with the math shown. The underlying cost is the same, only the presentation changes. If your fixed price and cost plus estimates are wildly different, that gap is actually telling you something. Either your fixed price markup is disconnected from your real costs, or your cost plus billing isn't capturing everything it should. Either way, someone is absorbing the difference, and most of the time, it's you. For smaller operators who aren't running multiple divisions, the principle still applies. You don't need separate legal entities or separate bank accounts. You just need separate visibility into your existing P&L. Tag your revenue by type. Track what each category of work contributes to covering its own costs. Most accounting software supports this already. The discipline of separating the visibility is the thing that really matters, not the organizational complexity. Once you understand your own cost structure deeply, something interesting happens to how you talk about pricing with your clients. You stop defending your number and you start explaining your value. Here's the problem with how most pricing conversations go. A client gets three bids. All three show a similar markup percentage, somewhere around 20%. The client assumes reasonably that they're comparing equivalent services at different prices, and they're not. Markup is not a standardized unit of measurement. It's a ratio applied on top of whatever cost structure sits underneath it. And two companies with identical percentages can be delivering completely different levels of service, staffing, oversight, and risk management. Let me make that more concrete. When a client hires us, that markup is covering dedicated project managers who actively track the financial performance of their job, involve them in the process of aligning and scheduling trades, and provide real time visibility into where their budget stands at any given point. It covers in house design professionals who produce and manage the documentation for their projects. It covers field supervisors whose sole job is the quality and pace of their build. And it covers the administrative and logistical infrastructure that keeps the project from becoming a coordination nightmare. When a client hires a single operator working alone at a similar markup, that markup is covering one person doing everything: selling, estimating, designing, managing, building, billing, and following up. That person may be excellent at their job, but they're only one person. And when they're on your job site, they're not on the phone with your supplier. When they're writing your change order, they're not checking on your schedule. And when they take a week off, your project also takes a week off. The markup number looks the same. The experience delivered is completely different. This is what I mean by markup relativity. The percentage means almost nothing in isolation. What matters is what's inside it. Understanding this changed how I approach the client conversation when we're not the lowest bid. Instead of apologizing for the number or trying to match a competitor's price, I walk the client through what their project actually gets. I help them understand that the question isn't who charges the least, but who delivers what I actually need for a project of this complexity. That conversation does something important. It helps clients self select. The client who's primarily motivated by the lowest number will self identify, and that's very useful information. That client in the future will scrutinize every change order, dispute every unexpected cost, and measure satisfaction primarily by whether they paid less than what they expected. That client, regardless of how well you execute, is unlikely to be a future referral source. The client who responds to the explanation of what's inside your markup, who asks follow up questions about your project management process, your communication rhythm, and your financial tracking, that client is telling you that they value what you deliver. That client, when you execute well, becomes a repeat client and a referral engine. I've played this out more times than I can count. A client goes with the lowest bid on a complex project. The single operator gets stretched. Communication lapses, the schedule drifts, change orders become contentious because there's no real process behind them. And eventually the client calls someone like us because they've learned that the hard way that it actually costs to have this infrastructure behind this work. Now, that's not a criticism of operators who run leaner businesses. Lean can be excellent, but it is a reminder that your pricing should reflect your model and your client conversations should help the right people understand why. There's a story that I want to tell you about a mini split unit. We had a project where our estimator, who is great at their job and has been with us for years, simply missed a mini split unit in the original estimate. It wasn't a judgment call or a scope dispute, it was a miss, a line item that should have been in the budget that simply wasn't there. By the time we caught it, the contract was already signed, the project was already underway, and the unit needed to be specified, ordered, and installed. And the cost of that unit, equipment plus installation, came in at almost exactly the full amount of the contingency that we had built into that project budget. So here's what happened. We went to the client, told them what had occurred, explained the miss clearly and honestly, and then told them that because of the contingency that we had originally built into their budget at the start of their project, that their cost was not really going to change. They were disappointed. Of course they were. Nobody wants to hear that their contractor missed something, and there was a moment of real discomfort in that conversation, but the project ended up finishing strong. We came in at or below the original budget number, and that client became a repeat client. The contingency didn't just save the estimate, it actually saved the client relationship. That's the real purpose of contingency in a job costing system. Not to pad the number, not to create hidden margin, but to price honestly for the reality of what residential construction actually is. And the reality is this: there has never been a residential construction project in the history of the industry that didn't have at least one thing that was missed, underpriced, or discovered mid build that nobody anticipated. Not one. The scope will change. The existing conditions will surprise you. The market will move, and lead times for things will shift. Something that was $8,000 when you estimated it is now going to be $11,000 when you go to buy it. We learned this the hard way on our early fixed priced work. We would price a bathroom remodel. We'd include the floor replacement. We'd get into the project, pull up the floor coverings, and then find out that the framing underneath was damaged or that the subfloor was inadequate for the weight of the new shower that the clients wanted. Or in an older house, that the floor joists themselves needed to be sistered before anything else could happen. None of that was in the scope. None of it was visible during the estimating period. And more than once, we were told by a client that because it was a fixed price contract, it was something that we should have expected, even though no reasonable estimator could have known this without tearing up the floor first. We ate those costs because we wanted to preserve the relationship, because we believed that doing right by the client was the long term play. And it was, but it was also expensive and it was also avoidable. The fix came in two parts. First, we got much more specific about our scope language, what existing conditions meant and didn't mean, and what was explicitly excluded, and what would trigger a change order. That reduced disputes significantly already. But the more powerful fix was building contingency into every project and explaining it honestly up front. For us, that's typically 5 to 10% of the total estimated job cost, depending on the complexity and the age of the project. Older homes get higher contingencies. Projects with significant unknowns like full gut renovations, additions over crawl spaces, or anything that touches the original structure, those usually get a higher contingency. Straightforward new builds with clean scopes get less. And we tell clients exactly what the contingency is for. The language that I use is something like this: this is a contingency for errors, omissions, and price escalations that we didn't anticipate. And I want to be honest with you. On a project of this scope with 1,000 line items in the estimate, some of those numbers will be wrong. That's not a failure of process, that's the nature of residential construction. This is a one of a kind project, and we're using historical data to predict future costs. The contingency is how we make sure that when those moments happen, that they don't affect your overall budget. Yes, that means admitting upfront that we're going to make mistakes. And yes, that feels counterintuitive, but every builder listening to this knows it's true. The question is whether you price for that truth or pretend that it doesn't exist and let the client find out mid project. What I've found consistently is that the contingency conversation done honestly creates more trust than it costs. Clients respect the transparency. They understand that you're not trying to hide something, that you're trying to prepare them for the reality of the industry that they've just entered. And the clients who respond well to that conversation are almost always the one who become great long-term relationships. The clients who push back hard on contingency, the ones that want it removed or who insist that the estimate should be exact, they're often the clients who will dispute every change order down the line anyway. They want certainty in an industry that doesn't offer it. And the contingency conversation surfaces that mismatch early, before you've signed a contract and before you started spending money. On fixed price contracts, every unplanned cost that isn't covered by contingency comes directly out of your margin. There's no other place for it to go. You essentially are just doing the work for free. So your contingency is the only structural protection that you have against the unpredictable. And in construction, the unpredictable is guaranteed. On cost plus contracts, contingency is even more important from a trust perspective. Without it, every time an estimate comes in higher than projected, the client questions your competence. With it, and with the explanation up front, those moments become proof that you planned honestly rather than evidence that you didn't know what you were doing. If you're listening to this and your current job costing system is somewhere between gut feel and whatever worked last time, here are 5 concrete steps to start building something better. Step 1, separate your costs honestly. Go through your existing cost structure and ask for each expense category whether it truly belongs in overhead or whether it directly ties to project delivery. Salaries for people that work on projects are going to be job costs. Software used for project management is also a job cost. The rent on your office building is overhead. Your business development expenses are overhead. This separation is the foundation that everything else is going to build on. Step 2, build billable rates for your internal staff. Take each employee whose time is billable to projects and calculate their fully burdened costs. Base pay plus taxes, benefits, insurances, and other direct employment costs. Then estimate their realistic billing utilization. What percentage of their working hours actually goes towards projects versus internal administration? Divide the burden costs by those billable hours, and that's now your billable rate. If you've never done this exercise before, the number will probably surprise you. Step 3, create visibility by division or revenue type inside of your P&L. You don't need separate bank accounts or separate legal entities. You need tags or categories or something like that inside of your existing accounting system that will let you see each type of work and how it's contributing to covering its own costs. Design revenue goes against design costs. Field labor revenue against crew costs. Production management revenue against production overhead. And when you can see each piece independently, you'll know immediately if one part of your business is subsidizing another. Step 4, stress test your markup by running the comparison. Take a representative project type and price it as both fixed price and cost plus contracts. Use your fully loaded job cost, including internal labor, at an honest billable rate. See where the two numbers land, and if they're within 5 to 10% of each other, your costing is likely working. If they're significantly further apart, the gap is probably telling you something. Either your fixed price markup is disconnected from your real costs, or your cost plus billing isn't capturing everything that it should. The last step, build contingency deliberately and present it transparently. Decide your contingency range based on your project type and complexity. Document what it covers, errors, omissions, and price escalations. Include in the explanation to your client presentation. Make it part of your standard scope conversation, not something buried in your fine print. The transparency will serve you far better than the protection ever could. The goal of all of this is not to create a perfect estimate. No estimate is perfect. That's why it's called an estimate. The goal is an honest one, a number that reflects what your business actually costs to deliver the project with appropriate protections built in for what you can't predict. Before we close, I want to take a minute to address a few things that I hear regularly that I think lead builders in the wrong direction on job costing. One, always winning the job at 20%, so believing it must be right. Getting the job and pricing the job correctly are not the same thing. If you're winning every bid, you might just be underpriced. The market will absolutely hire you at a margin that doesn't support your business, and they'll do it happily because they know that they're getting a deal. Winning work is not validation of your pricing, your margin is. Two, allowing yourself to be convinced that your employees are overhead, not job costs. This is probably the most expensive misclassification in construction. If a designer is working on your project, that time is a direct cost of that project. If a supervisor is managing your site, that time belongs in the job cost, not in the general overhead bucket. Burying project related labor in overhead makes your overhead look high and your job costs look low, and it makes it almost impossible to price cost plus work accurately. Three, believing that contingency will scare clients away. The opposite is usually true for the right clients. Honest clients who understand construction respond well to transparency about uncertainty. The clients who are scared off by contingency are often the ones who will dispute every change order anyway. Let the contingency conversations do the filtering work for you. Four, believing that cost plus is always cheaper than fixed price. If your job costing is accurate, they should be within 5 to 10% of each other. If they're not, your costing has a problem. Cost plus isn't a different price, it's the same underlying math with the work shown. The gap between the two is not a feature, it's a diagnostic. And last, figuring out how to do job costing when you're bigger. You cannot grow your way out of a pricing problem. You'll just scale the losses. A company that is underpricing at $2 million in revenue will be underpricing at $5 million, except that the losses will be proportionally larger. The overhead will be heavier and the margin for error will be smaller. Build the discipline now when the stakes are lower and the habits are easier to establish. Here's the thing about job costing that I want you to take away from this episode. It's not an accounting exercise. It's the foundation of every financial decision within your business. When your costing is honest, when it reflects your real labor cost, your real overhead structure, and your risk, your pricing becomes defensible. Your client conversations become cleaner, your margin becomes predictable, and you stop competing on price against businesses with completely different cost structures and start competing on value because you finally understand what value actually costs for you to deliver. The 20% convention isn't wrong because it's 20%. It's wrong when it's applied without understanding whether 20% actually covers what your specific business spends to deliver a project. For some operators, the right number is lower. For most companies with meaningful internal staff and infrastructure, the right number is usually higher. What matters is that your number is yours, built from your costs, validated against your contract types, and explained clearly enough that the right clients understand what they're buying. And when you have a contingency conversation with that client, when you sit across from them and say honestly that this estimate is built on historical data and that this project is the first and only of its kind, and here's how we've protected both of us when reality shows up, that honesty is not a weakness. It's the thing that separates builders who earn long-term relationships from builders who win jobs and lose clients. In the next episode, we're going to talk about overhead, what I call the silent killer of growing builders. You now know how to cost a job. The next question is whether the company sitting on top of those jobs is sized correctly for the work that you're actually doing. Because overhead is the expense category that can look perfectly reasonable for years and then quietly become the thing that's consuming everything you're earning. Thanks for listening to Brickonomics, and I'll see you in the next one.